All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester. I'd like to welcome you to the June 18th, 2025 webinar. We are joined today by Dr. Ralph Nyland. Ralph is a distinguished Service Professor Emeritus in silviculture from SUNY-ESF. Many of you, from the little notes you're dropping into the chat window, had Dr. Nyland as a professor when you were at ESF. So it's kind of old home days, if you will. Dr. Nyland has been, I counted it up before we were just about maybe a week ago. This is Dr. Nyland's 10th webinar as a presenter, which puts him, I think, pretty much at the top of the list of frequent guest presenters. And for that, I'm very appreciative. One, because I just really enjoy all of the content. He brings in great audiences, and it's just always a pleasure and treasure to be able to have this content. So with that, Dr. Nyland, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to mute my microphone and it's all yours. I'll just hover here in the background.
Thank you, Peter. Let me share the story of the sad saga and all that happens when interference returns. And start by referring back to the great philosopher Confucius, who said, challenging once and awful twice. And that's the story of when interference returns. These interfering plants, such as ferns, beech, and hobble, often form in the understory of stands, even without any overstory disturbance, and all require some control in order to enable regeneration of other species, and we do that by site preparation. So when interfering plants shade at least 30% of the regeneration area, take decisive action. In one little quick, easy field expedient way, Kimberly Bone developed, if you stand on a millacre plot and look at the plant or the tree that's most dominant, that's the one likely to become the place, the tree that occupies that place into the future. Now, pre-cutting or disposing of interference before any kind of overstory cutting has some advantages. First off, it's convenient. There just are not very many obstacles to get in the way of any machinery or any workers. Because of that, it probably will cost less due to the less lost time of operation. And it has flexibility because done before at time, you can use whole stand or single tree applications. Otherwise, the interfering species proliferate in the brightness of an opened understory like ferns. They cast a shadow across the ground, and that dense shade underneath the fern fronds limits the survival and development of tree seedlings. Now, ferns, once established, will last for who knows how long, probably dependent upon the tightness of the overstory condition as that begins to close. But ferns can be in abundance and prevent regeneration success for many years. Generally, control ferns by mist blowing. And when you do that, or use any kind of herbicide, follow all the rules and regulations, including and especially the ones dealing with worker safety. Many other hardwoods affect sites before overstory disturbances, such as the dense understory of beech, but it could be other species as well. Those beech root suckers darken the understory so that regeneration fails, and in the long run that reduces species diversity and simplifies the entire ecological system. Beech is a long-term problem. It starts in the upper left-hand corner with some beech understory, And with disturbance of some kind, that becomes more abundant, and those root suckers beat to mid-story. And if they're cut or die, they provide more and more dense beech understory. And then mostly you end up with beech overstory and dense beech in the understory in a recurring cycle, trapped in time and space, never to end, it seems. But beech and some other of these understory trees can be controlled by mistblowing or done mechanically to reduce the low shade and thereby enhance chances for advanced regeneration to form. Again, with use of herbicides, follow all the rules. Don't forget witch hobble, that multi-stemmed shrubby herb. Woody shrub comes common on many moist sites, particularly at the higher latitudes, and often forms a dense understory that interferes with regeneration of tree species. It also, you can reduce it by foliar applied herbicides, preferably before overstory disturbance, and again, follow all the rules and regulations. And also remember that your tending operations in intermediate age stands can remove unwanted species and reduce future interference either in even or in an uneven age stand, primarily by getting rid of the seed source, so that as you do proceed with your management, there's no source to start new trees. All best controlled in advance to promote advanced regeneration and keep it developing prior to an overstory treatment. But several species tend to commonly appear after an overstory disturbance or cutting, and that causes new interference, the awful part of confusion statement. Things like ferns, grasses, and herbs, American beech, striped maple, witch hobble, pincherry, black birch, even yellow birch. They interfere in a different way. They do inhibit establishment, but they reduce survival and they limit development of desirable trees. Little things like small patches of fern scattered throughout the stand, particularly hay-scented and New York ferns, will inhibit tree seedling development once they spread. And if the landowner ignores the problem in advance, then the ferns just spread, become more dense, causing a problem. Or consider American beech again. It will sucker off wounded roots, usually from residual trees, say within 10 to 15 feet. And particularly in stands with an open upper canopy and near those residual trees, you can get a proliferation of root suckers that can develop and again pose interference after the fact. Don't ignore the shade-tolerant striped maple. Even those cute little ones that you find in the understory, they persist in the understory before cutting. And once freed by some sort of overstory disturbance, they grow rapidly and release copious amounts of seeds onto the ground. And those seedlings sprout, soon overtopping other species of regeneration. But the interesting part about striped maple is they only last for about 20 to 25 years. And then little ones that germinate afterwards may continue as small plants in the understory. But the dense striped maple will kill off other trees, at least until it dies, leaving unfilled voids within the stand. Likewise, pincherry, great for deer, bears, birds, but interferes with long-lived trees, and the seeds remain viable in the organic layer for as much as 40 years. It has a lifespan of about 30 to 45 years, and during that time, it's producing seed. It's mostly a problem after cutting in even age stands or in heavily exploited stands of other kinds. And when abundant, pincherry reduces the stocking of other species. Heitzman did some work in assessing pincherry after clear cutting and found that As few as 3,000 per acre of pin cherry of any size at year 3 would cause negative effects. That's only 3 pin cherry per millacre plot. Bristow and Horsley down in Pennsylvania observed that as few as 385 trees at least 5 feet tall at year 3 also oppress seedling regeneration for other species, leaving these unfilled voids where it occurs. But look, you can easily check for these. Remember, a millacre has a radius of about 3.72 feet. I have the good fortune that if I stretch out my arms, the tips of my fingers define the edges of a millacre. So I stand there and turn a circle around and can count just 3 pin cherries on that millacre. At year 3, any size, interference is likely to be a problem. And note again this, seed production continues for about 30 to 40 years and the seeds remain viable in the duff for several decades. But little seed remains viable in the duff of 100-year-old stands. And that gives us a helpful preventive measure for pin cherry. Lengthen the rotation for even age stands, extend it to at least a century of time. Now, in addition to these, dense birch can also overtop other species. And where it does, it will limit or prevent the survival and development of those slower growing species, simplifying stand composition. But the critical threshold, we just don't know yet what that is. Birch is a long life species, both black and yellow birch, and so it will persist in the stand for long periods of time, well past half a century. As it develops, the dense birch develops into a single canopy layer, and the crowns become short and narrow because this is only a mid-tolerant species. And the crowns become thin, they become constricted. You begin to see openings around the crowns of some trees, and that slows diameter growth when these species occur in pure stands. That also would be true of other intermediate and shade-intolerant species. So, ferns, beech, striped maple, pin cherry, birches, and others, these are the ones that are important in the Northeast, but think about what would happen in the oak stands of the Midwest or in the mixed species stands of the Southeast. When any of these things or other interfering species appear after overstory cutting, free the desirable species in order to maintain species diversity. And that means a release treatment. Freeing young desirable stand not past sapling stage, key, not past sapling stage. And we have 2 treatments for that. One is cleaning and the other is liberation cutting. Now, what does a sapling mean? It means by definition larger than a seedling, so at least 4.5 feet tall, but smaller than a pole, so less than 6 inches in diameter. So cleaning cuts in the sapling stand to free the best trees from undesirable ones of comparable age that threaten to overtop or otherwise interfere with development of the crop species. So we do it to control the species composition and the crop quality. Now notice that many people loosely call this also pre-commercial thinning. But by definition, that means to release crop trees within stands not yet of commercial size, stands with trees too small to sell. So that definition would apply even to pole-sized stands. It's not the same as cleaning. Consider this case. Here's some species like pin cherry or striped maple overtopping desirable trees. And a cleaning would take off those overtopping trees to free the ones of comparable age to grow and develop into the future. Cases like this. Here we have fast-growing shade intolerance and mid-tolerance overtopping saplings. Here it's birch and pin cherry oppressing sugar maple. And here's a cluster of intermediate trees, interfering trees, marked in striped ribbon, oppressing desirable ones. Thanks, Peter Smollett, for that photo. Let's illustrate it this way. The orange-colored things are perhaps pin cherry or striped maple, growing much taller than sugar maple, for example. We would, with a cleaning, we would take off those oppressing trees. So we start with this and we end with this. Excuse me, we end with this. There are two other uses of cleaning. For example, we might find spatially scattered saplings of desired species surrounded by taller trees of another species. And cleaning would release the oppressed species to ensure its continued development into the future and enhance its growth. Here's the case, again from Peter. The pink flag, trees that we'd like to have, the striped flags, undesirable species that are oppressing the development of the ones with pink flagging. So let's use this diagram. With the green-leaved tree being the desired one, surrounded by taller trees of another species, releasing, cleaning would remove the trees around the selected trees, probably cutting other trees within 6 feet of the crop tree. So we might have a case like this representing a stand, and cleaning transformed it to this. Sometimes the Canadians call this point cleaning, starting with this and moving to this. Now, one important use of this is to sustain the development and survival of slower growing species. And a good case in point would be oaks that grow very slowly compared to some of the competing species. And by cleaning around these smaller oaks, you can maintain them as a part of the continuing stand. Or this, here's yellow birch, the larger trees, overtopping sugar maple, the smaller ones. And with no cleaning, this is what happens. That same area, 20 years later, 25 years later, is dominated by yellow birch. So in this context, cleaning promotes diversity by maintaining species that initially occur in subordinate canopy position due to their slower growth. It prevents conversion to a different forest community type during the early stages of stand development. It ensures selected trees develop into upper canopy positions or remain there and may initially increase understory plant diversity because of the space opened around the selected trees. Now, there's other cases where cleaning would be appropriate, as with spatially scattered saplings of a desired species surrounded by other species of similar size, and cleaning would release the desired species to promote its survival and growth. Let's go to this case. Here, notice that the good tree with green leaves is the same height as the one, so that it occupies a main canopy position. This case shared by Peter again, with the pink flag in the middle, the tree that he would like to keep and benefit, and the striped flagging the trees that are interfering with that pink flagged tree. So released, it would look like this, cleaning around the trees, perhaps at least by 6 feet. So you start with something like this and go to this. Again, this transformed to this. Again, sometimes called point cleaning. Or in other cases, it's called crop tree release by the crown touching method, as described by Perky et al. In this case, you would identify a crop tree and remove any tree that has a crown touching the crop tree crown or grows beneath it. So the X's show the trees we would need to remove in this case. freeing the crop tree, the desired one, to grow from trees of similar heights and of similar age, like this, released. Please note the dead branches, done by delaying the release until those branches had died. So we do this for better crown development and faster diameter growth. Note that crown touching method has also been promoted and used in trees well past sapling stage. Now consider a different approach. Perhaps selecting crop trees along an imaginary grid, starting like this, with this imaginary grid run through the stand, and you free the trees only at the grid intersections. Again, start like this, imagining a grid at some desired spacing, and free the trees at the grid intersections. Perhaps again, cutting anything within 6 feet. Perhaps one way to counter the early crown loss in pure stands with shade intermediate species and other shade intolerant species, freeing the trees at grid intersections throughout the stand. Or you could even leave only the crop trees at regular spacings, and this has been done quite a bit, at least in spruce fir stands, like this. So you imagine that grid again through the stand, and here you would cut everything else, starting with this and ending like this. Here's an example. This happens to be aspen, or this case in ponderosa pine in Oregon. Trees are freed at a grid spacing and everything else taken out. Now, such a treatment assumes abundant desirable trees within the stand. This approach will have a side effect that some people would consider desirable, in that the openness will promote herbaceous understory, and that has some benefits in wildlife habitat improvement. Whatever the approach you use, you need to ask the question, how many do I release? A commonly recommended thing that I found is for conifers to release anywhere between 200 and 400 per acre. Now think this, with a 10 by 10 foot spacing and cutting everything else, that would leave about 435 trees to the acre. If you stretch it out to 15 by 15 feet, that's just shy of 200 trees per acre. Again, assuming abundant desirable trees within the stand. In hardwood, some recommendations suggest using a stocking guide to determine how many trees would be present when the stand reaches a size for maturity. So for example, in oaks, if you grew those to 15 to 18 inches, it would be somewhere between 75 and 80 trees per acre. In northern hardwoods, you would release between 90 and 100 per acre, again, assuming that you have abundant numbers of desirable trees. But remember, the more you release, the higher cost. So look at these options. They go on the left-hand column from 15 trees per acre released up to 35 per acre, and the spacing would vary between 60 feet for 15 per acre, up to 40 feet for 35 per acre. And the right-hand column would show the amount of base oil that should be present when those trees reach 18 inches in diameter. So if you release those 35 crop trees at 40-foot spacing, you should end up with about 62 square feet per acre. So one needs to ask, how many of the released trees does the landowner really need, or how many would the landowner pay for? Note this. At rotation's end, in a thinned mixed species northern hardwood stand of 18-inch trees, and if the trees have 25-foot crown diameters, there might be 70 trees per acre with 125 square feet per acre. So the 35 release trees would account for about half of the basal area. That might be sufficient, for example, to maintain a component of black cherry in stands that would be comprised of other species. Remember, when you release trees in these fashions, that keeps the lower branch alive, so the crown lengthens, but potentially reducing lower bowl quality. Look at this case, the potential effect of lower bowl straightness, the low forking. Or this case, starting too early may also promote epicormic branches on the lower bowl, and if those persist, more knots. Note also that epicormic branches also often come out at an acute angle, and those acute angle branches will persist longer than a branch that goes out at a horizontal angle, potentially leading to low forking if the branch remains alive and continues growing. Instead, we'd like to have long-term quality development and can realize that by delaying release until the lower branches die, usually up to some minimum merchantable height, so at least 17 to 20 feet perhaps. Note this also, the effects of cleaning. You get bigger crowns, you get better radial growth, but the same heights, at least for trees that are present in the main canopy of the sapling stand. A sampling of responses from multiple sources indicated to me diameter growth will vary by species, by the openness around the released tree, and by stand age, but generally, growth increases appreciably by, say, 50 to 90% or more in northern conifers, and perhaps 1/3 more to double the growth in hardwoods. But the release will not affect height growth, at least for trees in the main canopy positions. What effect on quadratic stand diameter, the tree of mean basal area? I looked at these data from Gingrich for thinning beginning at age 20. That would be an early release. The black line shows what happens with the quadratic stand diameter in a stand not giving early treatments. And the orange line, the effect of cleaning, the gain from cleaning. And note that one effect from cleaning is to increase the steepness of the slope for diameter growth, so that you not only increase the quadratic stand diameter by the stair-step effect as shown in the middle, just taking out the smaller trees, but also because those released trees will grow faster into the future. Now, landowners have some alternative methods for removing trees during these kinds of release treatments: cutting, frilling with chemicals, foliar sprays, basal area. Again, with the chemical approaches, follow all the rules and regulations, and particularly be aware of worker safety. One old standard method is chop and squirt. Like on the left with a simple hatchet and a squeeze bottle, or using a more sophisticated device like that on the right. Or you could use a basal spray, where you have a chemical that's in some sort of a transport fluid like diesel fuel or herbicide oil, and you simply spray it around the base of the sapling. Or brush saw cutting works. If you cut those things close to the ground with a brush saw, you will minimize sprouting. The ones you get will be mostly off the top of the stump, sprouts that arise from adventitious buds in the callus rim, and we find that these die within a couple of 3 years. You could use a small chainsaw, even some of these battery-powered things that are coming onto the market in the last few years. Here's another alternative. I call it cutting leprechaun sticks. Other people call it high stumping. You use lopping shears on small saplings, or use a small chainsaw to cut the small saplings at a convenient height, but at least below the lowest living branch. The convenient height reduces worker fatigue. Below the lowing branch minimizes chances for survival and sprouting. it works. Or you can make a simple girdle. This is a great technique for a landowner to use on their own. A little simple saw like the one from a camping store. I cut a double girdle, and within 3 years, they're all dead. Trees up to 4 inches. With the cutting trees, it's best done during the growing season to minimize sprouting, a time when the carbohydrate reserves are mostly in the upper ground parts of the plant. If you cut in winter, those reserves are translocated into the root system, and that will make sprouting more likely. Now, consider an entirely different approach, perhaps as a compromise to reduce costs. Let's call it cleaning by rows or strips, here assuming abundant numbers of desirable trees. So you start with a situation like this, transform it to this, make it look like a plantation, starting with this, ending up like this, or this in Western conifers. You can mechanize this easily to reduce the cost, even using readily available equipment like this skidder. You just need to push over the trees. You don't need to uproot them or sever them. So you have available things like a forestry mower mounted onto a skid steer, a small bulldozer, a skidder, a skid steer with a pusher bar on it, anything like that that will push over or masticate the seedlings will do the job. So you start off with a dense sapling stand, and you clear these lanes and end up with something like this. It even will promote new herbaceous growth in the open lanes, at least for a period of time until the canopy closes. And that may have an important value as a wildlife habitat element. So here's a case with white pine, mowed lanes on the left, 30 years later on the right. The data are limited for effects of strip thinning or row thinning. 16-year annual growth in loblolly and shortleaf pine were significantly better, according to Kane. The first-year change in diameter growth of trees near the edges, more than 1.5 times the average, according to Schuler and Martin. But here, the 35-year-old Douglas fir farther from the edge than 10 feet did not respond. So you need to keep those mowed lanes, or at least the leaf strips, probably not more than 5 or 6 feet wide. For general growth information about all of these techniques, there are sources of information. I've listed some here. If you peruse the literature on the internet, you'll find many more than this. But there's information out there. But look, besides cleaning, don't forget liberation cutting. It means removing undesirable residuals from an old stand that overtop the sapling stand and that would interfere with the development of those saplings. So you might start with a case like this. That could be dregs from diameter limit cutting, for example. And liberation cutting would remove those either mechanically or with herbicides to free the young sapling stands to grow and develop. So look at this case. The red trees are the dregs from the past exploitive harvesting. The green ones are the desired saplings. You remove the dregs, you get something like this. This transformed to this, often called color removal or timber stand improvement. With this end result. One caveat though. Some of the trees that you would kill have particular values as habitat elements or for visual qualities. And if you take those trees out, you eliminate that habitat element. Once dead, habitat gone, other values lost. And consider these cautions as well, at least for release treatments in general. A release treatment in many ways is a last-ditch effort to salvage an unfavorable situation. And the poor position of the crop trees may reflect ecologic conditions poorly suited to the growth and development of the desired species. Also, you must consider how long the chosen crop trees have been oppressed and if they will respond to release, if in fact they are suppressed rather than oppressed. Since release treatments will seek to reverse a successional tendency, you need to decide if you can hold or redirect that trend. So, why release these understory conifers? Release not always prudent. Overall, ignoring interfering vegetation costs something. It means foregoing valuable species and their benefits, sacrificing biological diversity, and postponing the inevitable, the eventual rehabilitation to regain some kind of control over species composition and to promote a more favorable growth of the stand into the future. So do something with the first entry. And remember confusion, little problems get worse through time. You will find at the end a variety of sources that you could scrutinize if you want to pursue this topic more. Peter, that's the story of the sad saga.
The story of the sad saga. Thank you, Ralph, very much. So this is very good. I appreciate this. There's already several questions that have popped in. This is the time when people have questions, they can type them into the chat. And Ralph, while people are doing that, I've got two that I'm going to start with,
All right.
if you don't mind. And so you mentioned the potential for poor form when you do an early release. Is there a way to, I'm assuming that maybe you could, so the extent of that poor form, I'm assuming is largely a function of the amount of sunlight that you provide. So if you mentioned a 6-foot radius release, if you reduced that some, you would get less sunlight to the bowl. You would have the expansion of the residual perimeter crowns coming in and reactivating the self pruning of the tree that you left behind. But then you might need to do a subsequent release before you might otherwise. So you might incur additional cost. I'm just trying to think about if you're at a spot, and there's a question that gets at this a little bit. If you're in a spot where you have two choices, I'm going to lose these species that are being outcompeted. You showed the picture of the sugar maple under the yellow birch. If I don't take some action, but if I take some action, I may end up with a less quality form. How do you I mean, obviously, if you do nothing, you know what's going to happen. Those trees will die. So how do you mitigate that balance between release with out causing too much reduction in form quality?
My guess, um, the data show that the wider the release, the more exposure. So if you go to the 15-foot spacing that I illustrated, and I showed pictures of birch poorly formed as a result of that, that will result in low forking, I believe. You're right that if you keep those stands more tight, you have a lesser chance for that. And I'm not sure how much difference, say, you'd get between 6 feet and 4 feet. One of the possibilities is this crown touching method, which only takes away the trees that are touching the crown of the crop tree. And that might have a more gentle effect in a sense. I didn't find data, and I don't know precisely where that threshold opening is.
Mhm. So, and I guess you just, if the choice is between a poor form tree or losing that tree or that species because it's overtopped by a competitor, then I mean, then it's an owner's decision as to what they want to do and whether they want to make that investment.
Yeah,
So,
no, the case you're presenting is that first instance where the crop tree desired species is overtopped by faster growing ones.
right.
Uh, and almost think, what do you have to lose there? Um, the the cases I illustrated later, the desired species was in the main canopy, not necessarily in a dominant position, but in the main canopy. And I think there's the case where by releasing the trees too much, you would in fact promote low forking and epichromic branching. But most of the information we have about release treatments comes from the conifers, the northern conifers or the western conifers. Uh, so I guess I just am uncertain, but be prudent. Perhaps that crown touching approach is the way to start with trees that are already in the main canopy.
Hmm. Okay. And then the second question I had, and this goes back to the stocking of trees that you release, and you showed the chart of anywhere from 15 to 35 trees released, and then discussed thinning in a multi-species stand at 18 inches average diameter, having something like 70 stems per acre. Is there any guidance on the percentage of trees that you release that are going to die? So if you don't do a release, you can do some calculations from stocking charts about the probability and percentage of trees that die. But if let's say you leave 35 trees per acre, or you release 35 trees per acre, not all 35 of those are going to make it to the maturity of the stand. Do you know there would be, what percentage of them would you guess are going to make it?
Yeah, confusion also said life is a crapshoot. So,
I hadn't heard that one.
all right. So look, the thing you know is that by releasing these trees, it increases the vigor.
Uh-huh.
There's plenty of evidence that trees of high vigor will less likely die. Doesn't mean they can't die. Some will, as you say, but the probability of a vigorous tree dying is much lower. There's been recent stuff produced in Canada which has correlated uh, tree vigor with mortality percent, and they found the more vigorous the tree, the less likely to die. But that was primarily in larger sized trees. So I don't think we have any data to answer your question directly.
Okay. So several questions have come in. Do you want me to read them to you, Ralph? Is
Please,
that
if you will.
okay? Sure. All right. So I'm scrolling back. So Gordon wants to know if how beech leaf disease might change the influence of beech as a competing species.
Well, I would only say to me it looks promising. We'll have to see through time the consequences of it. And my concern, if beech leaf disease does kill the trees, would that trigger more root suckering? That's one of the proposed effects of the beech bark disease, that as those trees die, root suckering increased. I don't think we have direct evidence of that, but there is some circumstantial evidence. So if beech leaf disease does take out the understory and you still have trees in the main canopy or in mid canopy positions, might that induce more suckering? And to me, that's a long-term question that I can't answer.
Um, John Hooven wants to know if there is a pre-emergent herbicide that can deal with fern propagation from the spore bank um, I'm assuming after a harvest, but before those spores sprout and take off. Is there something that you can do to kind of get out in front of the fern problem?
I can't tell you except to refer you to the publications by Horsley out of the Northern Research Station at Warren, Pennsylvania. Steve did a lot of work with controlling ferns. And as a plant physiologist, I would suspect he looked at that question. So in the citations at the end of this, you will find one reference at least to Horsley's work, or you can go online and search for Horsley and ferns and see if he provided some insight to that. I don't know.
Okay. Uh, Walt Williamson says, if to keep deer out, someone fences an area that has been thinned to establish true regeneration, will the absence of deer browsing allow the native tree seedlings to better compete with the interfering species?
We can think back to the work that published out of the Forest Service Forestry Science Lab at Warren, Pennsylvania. Um, Dave Marquis, Todd Rousseau, maybe Susan Stout, that group. But they had established fenced areas, rather large ones, so that the deer were didn't get in there. And yet, if you look at at those exclosures inside of them, there was a proliferation of black birch and pin cherry. So excluding the deer is not in itself a way to prevent those species from coming in. I had one experience up in the Adirondacks where cuttings were made at a time of very low deer density. And in those cases, the birch overcame everything else. A little later in time, when the deer density had increased a little bit, but was still not at a harmful level, we got a mixture of birch, sugar maple, white ash. Uh, so I think the key is, if you can do it, not necessarily eliminating deer, but regulating the density to get to that threshold, which may be around 10 to 15 per square mile. And the way they did that up at the Huntington Wildlife Forest is through controlled hunting of antlerless deer. So that's the only information I have about it. But I don't think fencing itself will prevent the emergence of pin cherry and black birch and those kinds of species.
Okay. Bob notes, so it gives us his situation. Last year, they started a 100-acre mechanical extraction of beech, striped maple, and witch hobble. And they've been very successful with the control of beech and maple, but not so much on the witch hobble, which is now sprouting among the felled beech.
Yeah.
How safe is it to treat with herbicide? So this is part of the Regenerate New York program. So I'm guessing the safety is not so much, and Bob can maybe add to this comment or add pick up on it later. But so I'm assuming the safety is not about a human safety, but um, kind of a collateral damage effect. So
Well,
how do they evaluate the risk of collateral damage in that situation?
again, Horsley did a lot of work with herbicide control, and he did make some recommendations about witch hobble, or as I recall, at least striped maple. So I would refer you to that body of work that Steve Horsley published when he was then working as an active researcher in the Forestry Science Lab at Warren, Pennsylvania. uh, if you apply herbicides, you will also negatively affect whatever else is growing there. So the understory treatments by mist blowing, for example, you have to start from the beginning, and that relies on a viable seed source in the overstory uh, of non-beech species. If you don't have that, then um, you may have to go through a rehabilitation process where you just give in and plant that stand of conifers, one suited to growth and development in your area, and recognize that if you have only beech out there and you get rid of it, you control it, then you have to start with a new stand of a different kind, artificially created.
Okay. And we have, my apologies for the pronunciation, Kareen says, other provinces of Canada do not pre-select saplings like we do in Quebec. They are saying it's a lot of money for not much better result, waiting 25 years before a first pre-select. What's the best school of thinking in this topic regarding the knowledge today? So it's
Well, if you follow what's been going on in Quebec, they've had some real successes. So the early treatments do work. If you look elsewhere, uh, many years ago, in the 60s, I recall, David Marquis published a paper where he recommended just delaying the first removals, the first release until the trees had at least one merchantable saw log. So I think landowners have a choice. It does cost money, no doubt about it. If you cut trees with a brush saw, that's going to be between 1 and 1.5 minutes per tree on average across a stand. And then you have to buy a brush saw and all the equipment. We had to spend about $1,000 to fully equip ourselves with brush saws and gas cans and multiple versions of saw blades, etc., and had to go for the not the Walmart brush saw, but the ones heavy duty. So you do with cutting. Um, if you use brush saw, there's a big expense with that, and you have to regularly sharpen the blades, and there's a continuing expense with that. So if you can find an alternative methods, I think if you get started earlier, this idea of using lopping shears can go very quickly because you're starting in a fairly young stand, which are easy to clip off. I don't have any cost data for that, but I know from trying it, it goes very quickly. So it's one of, as Confusion also said, choices are tough. Make the one that seems sensible.
this Confusion is a very wise person.
Oh, you ought to get that book and read it.
So we tried inside one of our slash wells, we had pin cherry dominate. We had it was an area that had never been harvested, which I think was part of the problem. And then we protected it from deer, which was also a problem. And so we did a little pilot study to see if going in, it was about year three, growing season 3 or 4, and we went in and cut all of the pin cherry on plots. And this would have been with pruning shears or loppers or something because they weren't very big. And so we did that in the spring. By the end of the summer, those stumps had sprouted such that the regrowth was almost as tall as the, as the surrounding pin cherry. So when they were really small, that at least in that one situation, we didn't it didn't leave us with a good feeling. I can imagine if we had waited a little while, or if another growing season or so, or we had taller desirable species, that we'd have a better outcome. Our desirable species were sugar maple and red maple that were maybe 8 to 12 inches tall compared to 6 foot tall thin cherry.
Yeah, but if you wait until midsummer, it might be a better outcome. There's plenty
True.
of people who have published about that. Or any kind of cutting treatments, do it in summer during the active growing season.
Okay. And then we're going to come back to that, say, to another kind of spin on that question here in just a minute, I think. So I don't think this is a question for you, Ralph, but Tim Fenstermacher in Pennsylvania wants to know if there are any contractors who specialize in cleaning. If you can't get a hold of Tim, get a hold of me and I can get you in touch with Tim. Okay, Charles has a situation where he has moderately browsed red oak saplings that are overtopped by black birch and beech. He wants to know if it's worth doing a cleaning.
Again, you have to think about the future. Um, if you don't take out the interfering trees, the taller ones, you probably lose the oak. If you release the oak, you can probably get it to grow and develop if you also control the deer. So you need to think about an effective way to control deer. Fencing is effective but expensive. Hunting has proven effective if you control the deer over a suitable area. And it would have to be at least 200 to 400 acres, probably.
Okay. Bryce June, hi Bryce, with the New York State DEC, said in Western New York they're seeing beech leaf disease having very significant impacts on dense patches of beech understory.
Good to know.
Jake wants to know if girdling is an alternative. So if you girdle the competing trees, if that will reduce the likelihood of epicormic branching on your residual trees. So I'm assuming it's a slower, the mechanical may make for a slower kill and less dramatic exposure to changes in sunlight.
I girdled beech 2 to 4 inches in size. Did it in midsummer with a double girdle. Most of them had died or didn't leaf out in the second growing season. And all of them were dead by the third growing season. Now, whether that will provide you still have branches up there, and those branches will in fact provide some partial shade, but not dense shade. So it might work. It's worth trying to see whether I would do it at a small scale to see what happens.
Okay. I, Ralph, correct me if I'm wrong. I think I remember you commenting on a field tour that if the trees that you're releasing have an upper canopy position, so this might be a sapling canopy position, but if they have an upper canopy position when you release them, they're less likely to form epicormic sprouts than if you release a suppressed stem.
I do,
Does
yes, I
that
do.
sound familiar?
Yeah, I do think that trees of low vigor, if they're suddenly exposed, have a greater chance of epicormic branching. The experience I have, which I may have been talking about at that time, was where we had in after the ice storm, we reduced stocking to very low density, and we had saw timber size trees, small saw timber size, and they didn't develop epicormic branches below the first living branch, but they filled in the crown above it. So I think the larger trees you have, but I'm talking to get the epicormic branches as badly. um, those are all high vigor trees, even though they had the crowns broken out. So I really don't know what would happen in saplings. I just know that when I released yellow birch at wide spacing, they all developed heavy epichromic branching.
Okay. All right. So there's a question on replanting, which you've commented on, and a question on treating fern, which you've commented on. So here's a pincherry control. Tim, again, do you think an aerial herbicide of pincherry as soon as it leaves out in the spring would be effective to release black cherry, since it generally leaves out a little, since the black cherry leaves out later than the pincherry?
My guess is you should wait until the pinch area is fully leafed out and you're into the growing season before releasing it. Otherwise, you have a higher chance of it sprouting. I don't know that we have an exact date when that occurs, but we did release, we did check stumps of beech that were cut with a chainsaw and found that the ones we did in May, they sprouted. The ones we did in late June and July, very little sprouting. So I would wait until that pinch area is fully leafed out. I don't think that short delay would affect the black cherry very much.
So I think he's describing a foliar treatment of pincherry
Oh,
before the black cherry leaves out.
well,
I'm guessing that's what's implied by the aerial herbicide of pincherry.
yeah, it might
That'd be an
work.
interesting. It'd be it, yeah.
As
I
long-
guess you, Confucius would say, start small.
Yeah, and as long as you got enough leaf surface area and functioning leaves, so that stuff gets taken into the plant, it would probably work.
Okay. Okay. So Susan Stout is here. Hi, Susan. And she points out that Gary Miller has guidelines for choosing the number of trees to release. It's a chapter in the Silva Oak Manual.
Good, good.
Okay, and some people are offering various options, but looks like mechanical options for ferns. More people talking about beech leaf disease. All right, so Caleb says this just, it's not a question, it's just an experiences that he's having in northern Wisconsin. They hire contract crews to brush saw around crop trees in a 6-foot radius 5 years after harvest. Costs them $250 an acre. And he'd be interested in sharing information about costs if people have it from other areas. Okay. So Jess Cancelleri with DEC Forest Health on beech leaf disease, uh, pointing out that they're seeing high levels of spring defoliation, but the nematodes are surviving in the leaf litter year round. So in the short term, uh, the understory is, even if the understory is chemically treated or killed by the disease, there could still be high nematode levels. So those will likely persist and reinfect. I'm assuming would reinfect um, the beech. Okay. All right, so Caleb's got a question. Looks like post-harvesting in a clear cut or seed tree harvest, is there a regeneration height for desirable and or undesirable regeneration where you recommend the treatment for the removal of undesirable species is most effective? He usually uses something in the 5 to 10 foot range, but would be interested to hear other approaches. So, like, at what point? So, you showed the different types of sapling competition and saplings. At what is there an age or height that people should really start paying attention? And how do they make the decision about we're going to do the treatment, the release treatment this year or in 2 years or 3 years?
I have two kinds of experiences with one with clear cutting and the other with shelterwood method. And in the case of the clear cutting, we had at least 1,500 per acre of advanced desirable seedlings, at least knee high. The stands became wall to wall with raspberries by the third year, but by the 10th year, the trees had emerged through the raspberries and formed a closed canopy. And that would be the time when I would start looking. The biggest of those trees would be 15 feet tall, 10 to 15. That would be the cherry, ash, birch. The maple would be maybe 8 to 20, 10, 8 to 12 feet tall. In the other case, we did shelterwood. We studied shelterwood cuttings after understory mist blowing to control the beach. And again, we had a plethora of of new regeneration of birch and maple and other species that became overtopped with raspberries by the third year, but by the 10th year, the tree canopy had emerged from the raspberries. So again, that's when I would start looking for release treatments, not before you get a new tree canopy formed. And it could be anywhere from 10 to 20 feet tall.
So it's the canopy closure that's the trigger event of
Well,
the saplings.
that's at least my experience. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, Ralph, that's all the questions. Lots of people commenting here that they appreciated this presentation, which I did as well. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for some great questions. This is
And,
it's always fun to have great questions. So,
and
um,
remember confusion.
yes, confusion abounds. So Dr. Nyland will be back again at 7 o'clock, and I want to thank you all for your time and participating this afternoon. I hope you all have a great afternoon and a great day. Thank you, Ralph. I'll see you back here about 7.
Right. Be there.